70-742 Lesson 6, Configuring Active Directory in a Complex Enterprise Environment. We're going to take a little bit different perspective in this lesson rather than me presenting the PowerPoint and reading you what all the different topics are. Let's hit the high points on what you're going to be covering in this lesson, and then I'm going to show you it in action. I'm going to be using my Hyper-V environment on my home PC here to give you a little bit different perspective, maybe similar to what we would do in the classroom. Unfortunately, during the COVID-19 times, we are not in our classroom, so we can't have quite as in-depth environment. But let's take a look. In Lesson 6, we're going to be looking at configuring multiple domains, a multi-forest Active Directory infrastructure. We'll be creating forest trusts, creating sites, working with sites and services, working with our trusts and domains, managing subnets, configuring subnets. There's going to be a whole slew of terms that we need to understand, and I want to cover a couple of those terms since we're not going to read through the lesson a whole lot here. So let's start right at the top of our list of key terms, automatically generated trusts. Well, just as it sounds, these are trusts that are internal to a forest and are created automatically during domain creation. What is a bridgehead server? These are automatically configured by Active Directory domain services. Bridgehead servers take the changes made during intra-site replication, that's between domain controllers within a site, and then replicate those changes to the bridgehead server in a connected site. So we have intra-site replication. We also have inter-site replication. Intra is within a site, inter is between sites. We can have automatic replication of our Active Directory within a site between our various domain controllers. We'll have a configured bridgehead server, which is also one of our domain controllers, and it will communicate with another bridgehead server in a different site. So automatic replication of Active Directory within a site between all domain controllers, and then we control that traffic between bridgehead servers. That way we don't have, let's say we have an environment. I think in the last lesson I used the example of a network with multiple sites, and we've got 12 servers, and we've got 4 sites, and each site has 3 servers. Well, we don't have all 12 of those servers talking to each other. Within each site, the 3 domain controllers replicate all their information, intra-site replication. In each one of those 4 sites, one of those 3 domain controllers is designated as a bridgehead server, and it communicates with its other 3 partners, the other 3 bridgehead servers. Domain functional levels. These allow administrators to enable domain or forest-wide Active Directory features within your network environment while maintaining compatibility for older operating systems. The functional level of the domain or forest depends on the version of the domain controllers in the domain forest. It can't have a higher functional level than the lowest server. Domain-wide authentication. In an external trust, domain-wide authentication allows unrestricted user access by users in the trusted domain to the resources in the trusting domain. After an external trust is created, all users in the trusted domain will be able to authenticate and access the resources in the trusting domain. Well, and we just talked about this at an external trust. An external trust is a one-way or a two-way non-transitive trust between domains that are not in the same forest and that are not already included in a forest trust. External trusts connect 2 domains in separate forests to allow users in the trusted domain the capability to authenticate and or access resources in the trusting domain. Because external trusts are non-transitive, any existing trusts already in place with the trusting domain cannot be traversed by members of the external trust's trusted domain users. And since we were discussing non-transitive in that key term, let's look at non-transitive. Non-transitive. An explicit trust between two domains ignores any existing trust in the external or internal domain or forest. The domains in the trust only trust each other and will not traverse to any existing or future trust paths of either domain. And very similar to our domain functional levels, forest functional levels allow administrators to enable domain or forest-wide Active Directory features within your network environment. It's virtually the same explanation. Your forest functional level can only be as high as your lowest level server. Forest-wide authentication. This allows unrestricted user authentication and access by users in the trusted forest to the resources in the trusting forest. Hub and spoke topology, created by an enterprise administrator, disabling the bridge all site links option, and then creating site link bridges between a central hub site and each of its remote spoke sites. So instead of having a connection between each site, you designate a central hub site and create a connection to each one of these spokes. In place upgrade. If the domain controller is running Windows Server 2008 R2 with SP1, Windows Server 2008 R2, Windows Server 2012, Windows Server 2012 R2, you can upgrade each domain controller one by one to Windows Server 2016. Because the Windows Server functional level will be Windows Server 2008, 2008 R2, 12, or 12 R2, some schema changes will need to be made when using Server Manager to install Active Directory domain services on the first Windows Server 2016 domain controller. We discussed intrasite and intersite, the difference between intersite and intrasite replication. Intersite replication, through the use of bridgehead servers, replicates directory partitions from one site's bridgehead server to another site's bridgehead server. Each bridgehead server then replicates the changes internally to its replica domain controllers through intrasite replication. And in intrasite replication, all domain controllers within a site replicate with one another in a process called intrasite replication, whereby data is sent between domain controllers within a site. We also have something called the ISTG, the Intersite Topology Generator. It is assigned by the KCC, that's Knowledge Consistency Checker, which we'll discuss in a moment. The Intersite Topology Generator is a domain controller, we have one in each site, used to monitor and make connections with domain controllers in other sites to domain controllers in its site, managing inbound replication objects for bridgehead servers within a site. Now, the KCC, the Knowledge Consistency Checker, dynamically creates connection objects between domain controllers, allowing for addition and removal of domain controllers without having to manually configure replication partners within the Active Directory Sites and Services tool. Manually created trusts are just what they say. They're trusts that can be created to connect two domains within the same forest to one another, or to a forest, or domain to a forest, or domain to a completely separate enterprise. Now, there are two different ways that those Active Directory domain service partitions get synchronized. We can use IP transports or SMTP transports. IP transports replicate all Active Directory domain services partitions synchronously to domain controllers in well-connected sites. Because of its efficiency and reliability, IP transport is the preferred method of replication between inter-site partners. SMTP transports. Configured with the Simple Mail Transfer Protocol, SMTP, they send replication asynchronously via email messages. SMTP transports require the implementation of Active Directory certificate services and replicate only the schema configuration and global catalog partitions. As I just previously noted, IP transport is preferred. Some other key terms to be familiar with is selective authentication. This allows explicit authentication and access to resources in an external trust or forest trust. Site links define the logical replication link between sites to perform inter-site replication, allowing for faster and optimized replication between sites based on configured costs and frequencies. Site links manage the logical flow of replication between physical sites. Subnets, well, we know what a subnet is, correct? They're created to group and assign computers within the same network subnet to a site. This is a relationship between a subnet and a site. Subnets can be assigned only to one site and can be IPv4 or IPv6 subnets. At logon, domain controllers assign clients to sites based on their network address and subnet. Transitive. The concept of transitive. Trust authentication follows the flow of existing trust relationships that are part of the trusted domain. If a transitive trust is created with an external forest, the authentication can traverse the path of the forest's existing trusts. Trust relationships allow users in one domain to access resources in another domain. Trust relationships form the framework that allows resource sharing and authentication between domains. Trusted domain. Trust direction indicates the direction in which trust is given. The trusting domain is giving trust to the trusted domain. Therefore, the trusted domain is trusted by the trusting domain. Trusting domain. The definition is exactly the same. Trust direction indicates the direction in which a trust is given. The trusting domain is giving trust to the trusted domain. Therefore, the trusted domain is trusted by the trusting domain. And what are trusts? They're relationships between one Windows domain and another Windows domain. Or it could also be between a non-Microsoft Kerberos version 5 realm. Trusts are created to allow users in one domain the ability to authenticate and then access resources on another domain, forest, or realm. Critically important is understanding what a two-way trust is. Users in the internal domain or forest can access resources in the specified external domain or forest, and users in the specified external domain or forest can access resources in the internal domain or forest. If you create a two-way trust, a user with domain admin or enterprise admin privileges in the other domain needs to create a two-way trust in the external domain. So both domains have to create that two-way trust, and we're going to look at that. Two-way trust consists of two one-way trusts. Each domain is trusting the other domain, and each domain is trusted by the other domain. So what would be a one-way trust? Well, you can have a one-way incoming trust or a one-way outgoing trust. With a one-way incoming trust direction, users in the internal domain or forest can authenticate with a specified external domain or forest. If you create a one-way incoming trust, a user with domain admin or enterprise admin privileges in the other domain needs to create a one-way outgoing trust in the external domain. Very similarly, one-way outgoing trust direction, users in the specified external domain or forest can authenticate with the internal domain or forest. If you create a one-way outgoing trust in the internal domain, a domain administrator or enterprise administrator in the other domain needs to create a one-way incoming trust in the external domain. So in our previous lesson in lab, we looked at creating a child domain to create a domain tree. We're going to take a little look at that again in actual use, but we need to understand trust relationships. And additionally, in trust relationships, not only do users in one domain have access to resources in another domain, these trusts are what we call transitive. If we build a two-way transitive trust between multiple domains, understand that if domain A has a two-way transitive trust with domain B, and domain B has a two-way transitive trust with domain C, then domain A will also trust domain C. When our Active Directory is configured, that database is logically separated into multiple partitions. You have one schema partition per forest. You have one configuration partition per forest. Every domain will have its own domain partition. And there will also be an application partition. Let's take a look at some of the concepts. So they talk about multiple domain Active Directory environments, creating child domain. Let's take a quick look at that. So here is Lund-DC1. And also here is a Site2 that I created. And here is a machine that I called Site3. And here is a site, a server, a domain, contoso.com. They are all interconnected using one of our routers that we would use in our lab. And that router has 4 configured interfaces, as you can see here. I'm using the same interfaces. I simply didn't associate, I just associated each one with a particular site. If we take a look at routing and remote access, we can see that they are fully connected and that there is a routing table that does allow the transport of information between each one of the sites. There's our router. So we have connectivity. And if we look at this, you'll notice Site 1 and Site 2, they're on different subnets. So each one of our servers is connected to a separate subnet. Lund-DC1 and Site 2 are connected. It is a secondary domain controller for our Active Directory. And if we take a look in Active Directory users and computers, in domain controllers, we can see there is our Site 2 DC2. Since it was Site 2, I labeled it DC2. So it simply extends our Active Directory into a second subnet, into a second site. So now we have a multi-site domain. If we take a look at that in Sites and Services, because we've now got 2 subnets, I created those 2 subnets. I also created a second site. When Site 2 DC2 was initially joined, it was joined and it was entered into default first site name. I have not renamed this. I could rename this. I could right click and say rename and rename it Site 1 if I wanted. Or it could be a physical location, headquarters, or it could be a geographic location, Fort Lauderdale. In there, we can see there is Site 1. Well, hey, what's this Site 3? Or DC1, Site 3. We've got these that are left over from when we were doing other activities. In Site 2, there is our Site 2 DC2. So initially, when I joined, it became a server in default for site name. I right-clicked and selected Move and moved it to the Site2 site that I had created. In our subnets, you right-click and you say, I want to configure a new subnet. For example, I could type in 172.19.0.0 slash your prefix. Designates the size of your network. Or I could use IPv6 and then you would select which site that subnet is going to be associated with. Every site has to be associated with a subnet. You could associate multiple subnets with a single site. Let's say you had another subnet, let's say the .17. Let's do it. 172.17.0.0/16, and now that is where I have a child domain. I'm going to associate it with default first site. If I look here, I can see that association. So configured subnets, configured sites, domain controllers within each site. The domain controllers in each site have replicated connections between them. Now this one, for whatever reason, picked Tor DC1, which isn't even turned on. I'm going to create a new Active Directory Services connection, and I'm going to connect that site, and I'm going to say I want to use LUN-DC1. I'm going to call it LUN-DC1 and click OK. Now there's a connection there. I'm going to say, well, I'm no longer going to use the Tor DC1 by default, so I'm going to delete it. And now we have that connection. Now, do we have that same connection here? Let's take a look. It automatically generated that site connection. So we've got connectivity between sites. We can have intra-site replication between these domain controllers and inter-site replication between these domain controllers. How does that inter-site replication take place? It takes place through the use of IP transports, and here we can see that site link and the sites that are contained within it. If I wanted to create a new site link, if I were to create a third site and wanted to create a link to it, I would create a new site link. I would name it. I would select the sites that are not contained within it. For example, it might be a link between default first site and site 3. Click OK. Now, you can change the schedule. For example, say that this is a link between a read-only domain controller, and you only want replication to occur on non-business hours. You don't want to interrupt the flow of data during the business schedule of that remote branch on that very, very slow WAN connection. You can specify when replication is not available. You can tell it how often to replicate. Sites and services. Now we also have that child domain that I was referring to. So let's take a look at it. Here it is. Nope, that's the router. Where is site 3? There's site 3. Now it is a site called science.adatum.com. It is a child domain to adatum.com. It has its own directory partition. If we look back over here under domains and trusts, we can see science.adatum.com is listed under adatum.com. Now we also have the contoso.com organization, And we want to create a relationship between Contoso and a datum because we're partners and we're going to work together. And we want our systems to be able to resolve systems in the other domain. Well, how do we do that? Well, first we have to know about the systems in the other domain. So I'm going to go into DNS on a datum, and I'm going to say, first off, I need to say I want to trust, I want to be able to look at the domain, the DNS zone for Contoso, and I want Contoso to be able to look at the DNS zone for a datum. The Contoso DNS is 172.19.0.10. So I'm going to select the datum, and I'm going to go to properties, and I'm going to say I'm going to allow zone transfers to the following server. And here I'm going to type in 172.19.0.10 and hit enter. I'm going to apply, and I'm going to come over to Contoso, and I'm going to go to DNS, and for Contoso I'm going to say I'm going to right click on forward lookup zones and say new zone. It's going to say a secondary zone. It's going to be next. The zone name is a datum.com. I press enter. What's the host address? 172.16.10. OK. Next. And finish. In the same way, there is our datum. Because over here I said I was allowed to do a zone transfer to that address, and immediately that zone is listed in a different domain. On Contoso, I'm going to say I'm going to allow zone transfers to the following server: 172.16.0.10. Okay, I'm going to apply. I'm going to come over here to our DNS manager on a datum, and I'm going to say new zone. Next, secondary. Next, it's called Contoso.com. And the address for that hosts that is 172.19.0.10. It did find it. We do next, finish, and there is our Contoso zone with its single domain controller, and that's the only thing in that domain. So now our DNS is able to see the Contoso DC1, and the Contoso DC1 is able to see our DNS in a datum. Let's create a trust. We're going to go to Tools. We're going to go to Domains and Trusts. I'm going to right click on a datum, and I'm going to select Properties. Now, before we do that, one of the things we talked about was raising domain functional level, and that's how you would do that. You would do it right here, and you would select that, and if you could raise the level, it would be an option here. You already have a message saying this domain is operating at the highest possible functional level, so can't do it, but this is the way you would do it. We right click on a datum, we go Properties, we select Trusts. Now, Science is already there. We want to create a new trust because that was created automatically when we created the child domain. We want to create a new trust. Here's our wizard, and you can see we can do a Windows domain in this forest, which we already just saw with child, or another forest, our Contoso.com. Another forest, a Windows NT 4 domain, or a Kerberos v5 Realm Trust. Click Next. What's the name? It's Contoso.com. Enter. It's going to be a forest trust. A forest trust is a transitive trust between two forests that allow users in any of the domains in one forest to be authenticated in any of the domains in the other forest. I'm going to click Next. I'm going to create a two-way trust. Now, create the trust I'm going to do for both. I must have trust creation privileges in the specified domain, which means I need to be able to give permissions. So I'm going to do Next. What is the privileges? What is the administrator account in the Contoso domain? Well, it's Contoso /administrator, and I used our same default password. Click Next. I'm going to make it forest wide. Next. Outgoing trust, forest wide. It's complete. To make the changes, click back. To create this trust, click Next, and we can see a synopsis of what we're doing here. This domain, specified domain, two-way trust, forest trust. It's going to be transitive. Next. Trust relationship created successfully with Contoso. Everything worked. We do Next. Do you want to confirm the outgoing trust? Let's take a look over here. It says you should confirm this trust only if the other side of the trust has been created. Let's see if we've got anything over here. We right click, we go to Properties, Trusts, and there it is. In Contoso, there's the trust with the datum. It was created because we provided the Contoso administrative privileges. So I'm going to say yes, confirm the outgoing trust. We go Next. Do I want to confirm the incoming? Yes, I do. And finish. Transitive trust, transitive trust. Click OK. Come over here. We can see we have our transitive trusts. Let's take a look at properties. And we can see there's our type of trust. This domain, the other domain, the direction, it is a two-way. The transitivity of trust, it's forest transitive. We can validate it. We could save a file with details about the status. Or what authentication did we use? Name suffix routings. We could see, here's your suffixes. Okay? That is how you create trusts. So we covered many of the topics in Lesson 6, and we demonstrated the ability to have a trust between a child domain in a domain tree and creating subnets, sites, IP transports, replication between servers, inter-site replication, designating bridgehead servers, and intra-site and how we connect the servers to replicate within a site. And then finally, we demonstrated the creation of a two-way transitive trust between two different forests. Thank you.